6 months ago, the Biden administration faced escalating oil prices in America, largely spurred by Western sanctions against Russian oil and gas. These sanctions, aimed at curbing Russia's influence, inadvertently disrupted global supply chains. Unable to influence Russia or the Saudi led OPEC and unwilling to soften its sanctions stance, the US sought alternative oil sources to stabilize domestic prices and minimize political fallout. We will tell you all about it, but before that, if you are a fan of non corporate funded free news and analysis, you've landed on the right YouTube channel. Okay, let's begin. The White House re-evaluated its foreign policy options and reached out to Venezuela, home to the world's largest yet largely untapped oil reserves. While the timing of this move may appear coincidental, its strategic implications were clear. By engaging with Venezuela, the US aimed to secure a more controllable oil supply and use economic relief as leverage in broader geopolitical strategies. This approach was also aimed at improving US Venezuela relations, potentially countering China, India, and Russia's growing influence in Latin America, and addressing the migration crisis by aiding economic stability in Venezuela. In a notable shift, the US engaged diplomatically with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, whom it had previously accused of quote unquote narcoterrorism in 2020 and attempted to undermine by supporting opposition leaders. Instead of pursuing Maduro's arrest despite a $15 million bounty, the US chose a diplomatic route, highlighting a hypocrisy entrenched in US foreign policy approach. American oil company Chevron was swiftly granted a license to operate in Venezuela in November 2022, following a sanctions waiver a month earlier. This agreement allowed the US to unlock Venezuelan oil sale revenues previously frozen under sanctions, marking a departure from past practices where Venezuelan oil profits were seized via the US-based Citgo, a subsidiary of Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA. The seized funds had historically supported US-backed opposition in Venezuela. When the Guaido initiative faltered and President Maduro maintained control amid the disruptions in global oil markets caused by Western sanctions on Russia, the US adjusted its stance. The American government allowed Venezuela access to some of its oil revenue, leading to a renewed presence of Chevron in the country. Chevron swiftly capitalized on this opportunity, announcing a new drilling venture with PDVSA aimed at boosting oil output. However, this re-engagement was short-lived. 6 months later, the US let the sanctions waiver expire, along with any temporary business licenses for operating in Venezuela. Sanctions have long been a tool for the US to influence global dynamics, but executing this strategy is becoming increasingly challenging as countries seek alternatives to a Western centric world order. Remember, in February 2020, the US sanctioned Russia's Rosneft for facilitating the sale and transport of Venezuelan oil, a practice that would presumably be acceptable for American firms under similar circumstances. At the time, then Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin declared the U.S. intent to prevent the exploitation of Venezuela's oil by Maduro's government, even as the U.S. itself was engaged in redirecting profits from Venezuelan oil. But the moment Venezuelan opposition candidate Maria Corina Machado was barred from the upcoming presidential elections scheduled for July 2024, Biden administration changed tacks. The Supreme Court banned Machado from politics for 15 years, citing her involvement in corruption activities orchestrated by Juan Guaido. These actions had led to significant losses for Venezuela, including the dispossession of national assets abroad. Washington, which champions the ideals of democracy, advocating for elections that are as free and fair as those it purports to conduct domestically, has found in Machado's disqualification a pretext to reimpose sanctions on Venezuela. The US holds itself as a model of clean and democratic processes. LOL. However, the real reason is different. US oil prices have decreased, domestic production has surged, and the demand within the country has diminished. This shift reduced the urgency of accessing Venezuela's vast oil reserves, which were once seen as crucial. This situation leaves other international players, including the idiots in Europe, without access to Venezuelan oil, effectively ending what might have looked like a more inclusive engagement. This has led to two direct consequences. Latin American nations aren't going to trust Washington on its words ever again, and the region will tilt more towards Russia, India, and China. And when we talk about sanctions, how can we forget the biggest sanction in world history, the current sanctions on Russia? The growing ineffectiveness of the sanctions regime has highlighted the resilience of the Russian economy and challenged the effectiveness of a long-standing US foreign policy strategy. This has led to calls for re-evaluating an approach that has been a staple of US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. Watch this video to know why US may not sanction countries post Biden.